We're going to take one more crack at Python Bootcamp. For those of you who didn't do Python, we'll finish this up next Tuesday. Then we'll get into the textbook the week after that. Before we get into the material today, this is the way I would have solved the little exercise that I gave you last Tuesday. 5 lines of code. Very simple. I'll give you your graded homework back on Tuesday. Any questions? We've looked at the if statement, and the problem that we realized with the if statement, or I hope you realized with the if statement, is that it executes once. And there's no way to re-execute that if statement without rerunning the program, unless you use a while loop. And that's what we're going to start to look at today. So the most important thing about the while loop is that it allows us to execute our code blocks over and over and over again. And we'll see in a few slides that there are basically about 5 different ways that we can tell that while loop to execute. Now, the key word, very simple, is while. Always the first keyword in a line, and it's always lowercase. The condition is going to evaluate basically down to either a true or a false. Now, there are different ways to do that, and again, we'll look at that in a few slides. But basically, we break it down to a Boolean. Is it true? Are we going to continue? Or is it false? Are we going to go do something else? First line always ends with a colon, and you should start to see a trend with Python scripting where we do things like while loops, if loops, for loops, that very first line with the keyword in it and the condition is always going to end with a colon. And then finally, again, we have an indented block of code that is going to run, and that's called the while clause. So if we try and compare them to the if loops that we've been using here the last couple of weeks, it's like an if statement. The program continues after the if statement, and we said when we started today there's no way to go back and repeat that if statement if that's all we have in the program. But at the end of a while clause, it's going to jump either back to the beginning of that clause until we meet a false condition, or it will return back to where the program is running and go back and do the information that we have available, or process the script that we have available. And if we were to look at a code comparison, here's our while loop. Pretty simple. We have some sort of while condition that we're looking at. While true, we're going to print hello world. We're going to add my computer equals 1. Or this is the if loop, and there's no way to go back. We add this together and it doesn't work. So if we look at the code for this, we'll just have a continual, it's going to run once and quit. This is a useless statement, the lesson 5, because there's no way to back it up. And of course, if we do the code run, all we see is hello world. So let's take this and put it back in to a while, or put it into a while loop, and take a look at what the flow chart might look like for that. And so we've got the start, we have the end, now we have a decision point, which is our while loop. But when we look at it, if it's true, it's going to print hello world. We're going to implement a counter by 1, and we're going to go back into the while loop. When we reach our condition, and once that condition's false, then we're going to exit the program. So if we look at a code run for that, or the code for that, this is what we have Who can tell me what a \n does?
New line.
New line. What's the backslash?
Escape.
It's escape. Very good. All right. On the while loop, we're implementing the counter, and since it's going to keep circling back until our criteria is met, we'll print hello world out 5 times. So the comparison, an if loop executes once. If there is no other code associated with it, or a while loop, we can control how many times it's going to execute. Yes, for those of you who had the fundamentals where they talk Python, you should already know this. For those of you who are new to the coding with Python, this is one of the key points of this language. The condition check for each iteration, that means that every time that program runs, it's going to check the while clause and find out if it needs to continue or not. Now, one of the problems we can get into with a while loop is what a lot of programmers call an annoying while loop. And it comes from not sitting down and understanding what the while loop is supposed to do and how you're going to program it. Take a look at this piece of code and the result. What's the problem you see?
It doesn't exit.
Yeah, it doesn't. It can't ever. There's nothing in there to help it reach that condition.
Right. What's the condition? That it would be totally unknown to the user.
It has to equal your name.
It has to equal your name. Correct. In the fundamentals class last night that I was working with, they didn't grasp the concept that when you put an input statement and say enter your name, you don't also enter your name in that input statement. You wait till the program runs. You had to be there. All right. So this is what we got. We run it, we get Frank, Fred, Harvey Kunkelmeyer. I don't care what you put in there. Until you get your name, this thing is just going to keep running. Again, if you're an end user that's got the program and you can't see line 10, you can't see any of the code, this is going to be frustrating as all get out. So finally, when you put in your name, thank you, the program ends. True, you could put it in the documentation. That might work. There's another annoying loop that we can get into, and this one involves while true. Notice we don't have a variable there that we can change, so that's just a cursor. So what's the problem we have with this one?
It's not saying what's true.
It's not saying what's true, and how do you change line 10 to false? You don't. It's going to run forever. Yes, those of you who know Python know that there's a break statement we can use and a couple of other tricks, but as written, this piece of code is going to run forever, as the example shows. That's interesting. Ignore my side comments. All right, steps to writing a loop. This is the way I do it. However you develop your process, you can. Are you guys having fun in the back of the room?
No, we're going over what you had. I had it down. He didn't yet.
Okay. I apologize, but it looked like you were doing anything but Python. Steps to writing a loop. These are the things that I look at when I do it. First of all, I want to decide what's the inside of the loop going to look like. How is it going to work? What do I need to accomplish? And then I want to need to look at what loop type do I want to use? Do I want to use a true-false? Do I want to use a counter? Do I want to use a priming reader to make it work? And we'll talk about those loop types in just a second. Then I want to set up my variables before I get the loop to run. So there's some planning that goes in, and if you'll think back to how I've got my scripts set up, I have indicators for variables, local, and functions and everything else. That's part of the process that I go to. I'm going to process the results when the loop is finished. How do I need to finish it? And we're going to do an exercise called the grocery list here before the end of class, and that's one of the things we need to look at. What's going to finish this loop? How is it going to work when we get done? And then one of the things that some programmers do, totally up to you if you want to, they will take that loop and not run it, but they'll walk through it with different variables. And they use their fingers and go through, okay, if my variable equals carrots, all right, what's going to happen here? What's going to happen here? It's a process you can do. You can also think through it if you want to before you run that code. If you've done a good job in planning your pseudocode and working through a flow chart, then it should be pretty easy. Well, we've talked about the types of loops that there are. And there are 5 common loops that we can take a loop at. So the first one is a Boolean, true or false. We saw some poor examples of that in the annoying code that we just looked at. But we evaluate a value to either being true or false. Remember, that can be a variable. So we can set that variable up to be set to true, to set to false, and that will help us terminate our loop. The next option is a loop with a sentinel value, and we see this a lot when we do database work with Python or we're reading files in. And we'll look at this, I think it's either in chapter 3 or chapter 4 of the textbook. A sentinel is an object that has no value to the data that you are processing. All it is a marker that when the script sees it, it will stop the while loop, as an example. And we'll take a look at how those work. One of the things that we did out at FAA was set up sentinels to read in data files that had been pre-recorded on different missions. So we could go through and check the performance of the equipment. And so at the end of each of those data files, when they actually stopped recording in the airplane, it actually set a sentinel for us so we would know that that was the end of that file, or at least that was the end of the recording cycle. The next one is something called priming read, and that's where we would have a variable, and we'd set that variable to a certain value. And then that value again would be changed or modified as we went through the while loop until it finished. A real easy one to set up is a while loop that uses counters. You count the number of events that happen. When you reach a certain level, either the while loop changes, or you go to a different while loop, or you terminate the program. Very simple, easy to implement a counter. And of course the last one then would be a minimum and a maximum. So you set a value when the while loop is going to fire, and it will fire until you meet the maximum value that's available. Runs very simple, works very easy. All right, let's take a look at a requirement. We'll talk about the requirement. I have a copy for each set of tables, so you guys can take a look at it, and gals today, and then we'll work on the pseudocode, the flow chart, and the option. And here's the requirement. Create a script that allows you to enter items in a grocery list and their price. When finished, the script will display an expected total for your grocery shopping. So first of all, what's the requirement? Just take one per table. take a look at the requirement, talk it over between yourselves, and sketch out some pseudocode. And what we're going to look at is we're going to do the pseudocode first, we're going to do a flow chart, and then we'll take a look at some programming.
So you want it to just...
All right, when we look at the grocery list, one of the key things we want to do is think concept, not code. Where a lot of beginning programmers get in trouble is they write code instead of pseudocode. Pseudocode is English. It should be very, very simple and describe what you're going to do. That's all. It's a tool to work from. One of the exercises we got into out at FAA that we didn't do at Tinker, and I wish we would have, was to sit down and write the pseudocode. And our FAA team lead would come in and say, here's what we're going to work on next. I want pseudocode in 15 minutes. And we might be talking about a requirement that would generate 5,000 to 6,000 lines of code when it was done. So that's where I cut my teeth on writing effective pseudocode. So let's hear some of the options that you came up with. If we boil down the requirement, what do we actually have to do? That's the way I look at the pseudocode. And so for the code that I wrote, the first thing you have to do is enter an item. Okay, we're talking pseudocode. We're not programming yet. Second thing you have to do is enter a price. Third thing that's going to occur is add the price to the total. And then we have to figure out a way to continue until we're finished. After we're finished, there are no other items to enter. All we have to do is print a total. Take a second, based on what you've done, well, take about 4 or 5 minutes. Based on what you've done, and draw out a flow chart on the back of your paper. Put both of your names on it, please, because I'll want that back. Draw out a flow chart on how you think your program is going to work. We've got a start, and we've got an end program. We've got a decision point. I indicated mine, continue equals true. All right, and we've got a loop. My loop goes up this way if true. Input grocery item and price. Total equals total plus price. In a flow chart, I think it's all right to put some code in. I'm not going to put in inputs and variables and all that. We're just trying to figure out what we're going to do. This is going to evaluate until it's false. I'm going to print the total, and I'm going to end the program. This is done in Visio, and you all are a lot smarter than I am on this. I believe as CIT students, you still get a DreamSpark account, yes, and you can still download Visio, I think. All right, if you can, as we do flow charts in this class, if you want to use Visio, that's fine. It's got a real good flow chart program with it. Very, very easy to use. If you want to draw them by hand, that's fine also. So if we look at this, it really starts to become very simple. We compare our flow chart with what we did with our pseudocode, and we end up with a program that's something like this. So go ahead and take a couple of minutes and type this in. In the back, can you all see that, or do I need to blow it up? Good? Okay. While a couple of you finish up, let's analyze what we're doing in the code. What happens at line 8? What have we done?
We made a null string. Empty string.
We made an empty string. We let Python know that my item is going to be a string value. What did we do in line 9?
Set up variable.
Somebody other than Brian. What did we do in line 9? Come on, if you all aren't getting this part of it, and don't be shy to speak up, please.
We set the price, the starting price to 0.
Okay, and specifically
Float at that float.
as a float, as a decimal, right. The same in line 10. Line 11 does what?
It says repeat to true.
It sets a repeat value to true, just the way I decided to set it up. Then lines 13 through 19 are pretty simple. It's just the while statement. What's missing?
Where you set my repeat to true or false.
Exactly, where we set my repeat to true or false. So right now, if we run the program, this is the result that we would get. It would go on forever because the piece that's missing, and you have the next half hour to write, is how are you going to get out of there? And remember, when you exit the program, you have to print the total price. Now, don't be an overachiever and add extra to the program other than the exit and printing the final price, because we're going to look at doing that next Tuesday. So you have the next half hour to finish up. How would you exit the loop? Go ahead and experiment with different loop options if you want to. Print it out as a PDF on the printer and make sure your name's on it. There's the code one more time. When you think you've got a good solution, print it out and bring it up.
Can you show that other slide real quick?
Which one?
Is it just code how to exit the loop?
That one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that all you want us to do?
That's all I want you to do.
Alright.
All you have to create is a statement within your while loop that's going to allow it to exit. Okay.